As I mentioned in the previous video, and many times prior to that, things are changing, gentlemen. Things are changing far more rapidly than most of us can keep track of. And more importantly, things are changing so rapidly that the old guard, the older generation of men, can't really keep proper track of the way sexual dynamics work these days. The things that were true even 20 years ago, which isn't a while, or even 10 years ago, as I pointed out, or perhaps 7 years ago, they're not really true anymore, not to the same degree. It's always a question of degree, of course. And if you go even further back, 30 years ago, forget about it. It's a completely different can of worms. And it's on that point that I want to pick up the discussion on e-thoughterry in general, because it really is a new paradigm. And what we are observing is unprecedented, if only because the technology for it never existed prior. So there are a number of platforms online that cater not entirely, but primarily to quote-unquote male interests. And what are male interests here? Well, I would simply define them as the interests that men have with respect to the opposite sex, which is essentially horniness and desire to be close to females, nothing beyond that. In the most extreme cases, you have things like chatterbait, which is a sexual free-for-all, and pretty much anything can happen there on camera. But that's probably not the most interesting element in this equation, this new equation of the sexual market. Not at all, because it's pretty much go there and knock it out. Get your job done, so to speak. Blow your load. It's like any type of pornography typically is. There's nothing special about that. And more importantly, with respect to something like chatterbait, there's no obfuscation. Now, when we move from chatterbait to other platforms, such as Twitch, and Twitch at least was primarily a video game streaming platform, to what I might describe as intermediary platforms, then things get a little bit trickier, because OnlyFans permits a fair degree of lewdness. You can also do nothing sexual on OnlyFans, in theory at least, and on Twitch there's body painting and what have you. But the current generation has increasingly a strange addiction, not just to pornography, which is a separate topic, but I suppose it's related because it's also based on the internet, to this type of e-girlery, e-thoughterry. And we all lament why that's the case. Well, for one thing, we can certainly observe with respect to something like OnlyFans and Twitch is that a lot of the most successful females out there are not quite plain Janes, but they're also not the most amazing lookers. I'm sure many of you have heard of the infamous Pokimane. And Pokimane is simply a mid-20-ish now, I believe, slightly above average looking female who puts makeup on, basically, and plays games. There are a couple of photos of her without makeup. You wouldn't be thinking to yourself, amazing. No. She's slightly above average. She's got decent facial structure, but she's nothing to write home about. And increasingly with OnlyFans, you have a platform where every female and her mother, in some cases, actually, are on the platform. In fact, there's a well-known erotic presenter, if you want to call her that, whose mother not only approves, but claims that she's her biggest fan, and interpret that as you will. Increasingly, we have a market where average-looking women, slightly above average, I'm considering the broad middle, not the extreme ends, are able to make insane amounts of money simply by existing, not coming up with original content, not thinking for themselves, not creating products for other people, nothing but just existing and body painting. Usually, slightly above average females presenting themselves to the world and making absurd amounts of money. But it always takes two to tango. So what is the problem? The problem, of course, is simping. And simping is, I think, definitely a phenomenon people are familiar with, especially in the manosphere, and is certainly frowned upon and looked down upon and viewed negatively. Rightly so. But I don't think people understand the core of what's going on there with the simping. But if you were to ask these guys what they really want, very few of them really think they're going to get a relationship out of it by throwing a couple of dollars, or in some cases a couple of $1,000 at these e-girls. No, they don't think that, at least on average. But they're also getting something from that they're not getting from ChatterBait or pure porn sites like Xhamster or YouPorn. No, what they say, if you ask them, is that they're looking for a so-called connection. This connection we might view as some sort of intermediary form between nothing and a relationship, but there you have it, this word connection. This word connection is a bit misleading because the people who are stating that, the men who are stating that, don't really understand what they mean themselves. Most of the simps, I think it should be very clear, are not particularly red-pilled on these issues. If they were, they almost certainly would not be throwing ridiculous amounts of money at e-thoughts on a platform for doing nothing. I get at least throwing money at working girls at ChatterBait. I mean, they're effectively prostitutes in some sense. It's an exchange of services, sort of. But just playing video games, most of us play video games for fun or to pass the time. And unless you're a pro or near at that level and you can do amazing things, well, there must be other outstanding reasons for paying these people that much money. The problem with this word connection is it's used for men and women is that it's naturally ambiguous and it's never well defined. Because you'll hear people talk about things like that too in real life, about relationships. I want a deep connection with my partner. What does that mean? What it actually means is I want a hormonal cocktail that's going to get my neural rocks off. Something that's going to really, really make me fall for this person. That's what they mean by connection. They don't mean anything mystical or spiritual, and they usually mean somebody that they find attractive, right? So somebody really attractive and somebody you have quote-unquote chemistry with, right? That's what women like to use, this term. I didn't have any chemistry with him. Same with men. Men envision this deep connection with females, and it's part of the modern-day love propaganda. But men and women don't have deep connections. They don't. Men and women need each other to reproduce, and they have to tolerate each other towards that end. That's it. There's no deep connection between men and women. Sure, some men and women convince themselves of that, beyond that. But the question remains as for common interests and who you'd actually want to spend time with, copious amounts of time with. It's almost certainly not going to be your wife. Your wife is there as a means to an end, just as you, the husband of this presumptive wife, are there as a means to an end for her. These guys who are engaging in this type of simpery are effectively engaging in a kind of post-postmodern romance about which they know very little. They do not understand that the word connection, when they use it, well, I'm looking for a connection by throwing money at this e-girl. By that, they mean effectively nothing because they don't understand that the kinds of connections they think they mean don't really exist between men and women. Men and women need each other for reproduction, and so they come together. And you might quip, well, they also come together when they're not reproducing. Sure, hormones. There you go. But how many women do you actually know, honestly, that you want to spend a lot of time with, playing games, talking, hanging out, engaging in sports, going on hikes with, for the people that they are, for the qualities of their mind, for their character? Those people are overwhelmingly male, I think you would know. And when you do those things with women, or your girlfriends or wives, you always do it under the pretext that they're just that, your girlfriends and wives. It's the hormonal connection. Now, you might argue that men and women have a deep bond because they reproduce and have children with each other. Well, I don't know what happened to that bond, but I can tell you that more often than not, in these divorce situations, this quote-unquote deep bond gets disintegrated into nothingness, and the man is chucked by the wayside. So, deep bond, I don't think so. And so, these guys who are engaged in simping are fundamentally not aware of their own emotions, and they don't know their own nature, and they certainly don't know female nature. They might have some sense of it, thinking that only if they could get a real girlfriend it would be that different. But the connection is poppycock, because there never has been this deep connection. Love propaganda, as I call it, is there to convince people, both men and women, that there is a bond far, far stronger between men and women than has ever existed. Because the bond is very tenuous indeed. We see the bond wither and decay in the face of difficult marriages and divorce. We see the bond wither and decay with every breakup. There is no deep, deep bond between men and women. Men and women are reproductive vehicles that need each other. And the sooner everyone gets on the same page with this reality, which is the truth, by the way, the better. Because everyone will have a very good notion of what these things are. Now, on a final note, there are some people that argue that we as a species need this illusion. The online pundit Eric Weinstein uses this term, load-bearing fiction, because the fiction bears this burden, this load for us. So if we talk about connections between men and women and bonds between men and women, we might be able to convince them that it's true. And then we might be able to convince them to engage in this stuff. And maybe, by dint of collective delusion, they might convince themselves and they might pull through and figure it all out, just maybe. And I won't discount the possibility that sometimes that actually happens, but it's pretty rare. Most of the time, men and women in this regard, because of different reproductive needs and just being completely different people, are at loggerheads. And I think ultimately, this nonsense about these guys looking for connection, sympathetic though I might be in some sense, it's a symptom of a lack of knowledge and a lack of experience. And maybe, just maybe, some of them know that. Maybe if they actually dealt with women in a quote-unquote romantic setting, maybe they would become aware of that. Maybe their delusion, their fantasy, the bubble of that would burst. And maybe they don't want to realize that. Maybe they don't want to come to terms with that. But I think it's really important, now more than ever, to dispel this notion that men and women have a deep connection. They don't. They've never had a deep connection. They have a reproductive connection, and that could be perceived as being deep because, after all, each person's contributed 50% of their DNA to the child, right? But it's not what's meant by that term. And that probably is the biggest piece of love propaganda we've all been subjected to, certainly during my lifetime. Not so much these days, but because the term has been around for so long, a lot of these guys get taken in by it, and they start using the same terminology. So, very, very dangerous. It is a post-postmodern romance, the e-girl or the e-thought and the simp. And bearing that in mind, I think maybe now more than ever, some of the basic understanding of MGTOW and red pill ideas in the manosphere, it's probably the most important thing young guys can access to, given the absolute state of things, given the minefield state of things going forward. Anyway, gentlemen, hope you have a decent weekend. I'm still alive. I'll check you out later. And as always, may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.